This here is the Nintendo 3DS. For the past 12 years, this thing has been providing me with all of the gaming experiences I could ever want, and it can probably last me another 12 years. Oh no, it died! What am I gonna play now?
Like living beings, game consoles die. Most game consoles are generally around 5 to 8 or so years before a follow-up system releases. But even when a company's next-gen system releases, they still usually support the prior system for a couple of years. When you launch a new console, it's not a good idea to immediately abandon your last system because for a lot of consumers, they can't immediately fork over $500 to upgrade to the new system. So it's worthwhile to support the prior system for a few more years, typically around 3 or so. But once a couple of years pass, most consumers have moved on to the new system and the prior system dies.
It's always tragic when a system dies, and the internet sure likes to show how upset it is when a system dies, even though they didn't care about the system months prior.
Death is a natural part of life, and game consoles are no exception. It's gonna happen no matter what, but it's always up to the company to decide if their console is gonna die with a bang or with Dr. Mario 64.
Today I will go over the death of various consoles and figure out why they died earlier or later than expected. Then maybe I can figure out why my 3DS died.
So what defines the death of a console? Well, it kind of depends person to person and case to case. To me, a console dies when it's no longer being supported. Official games aren't being released for it anymore, and online storefronts shut down. The last one obviously doesn't apply to a lot of older systems, but it gives some newer systems shockingly long lifespans. Take the Nintendo 3DS and Wii U for example. The 3DS was released in March of 2011, and while it struggled at the beginning of its life, a price cut, various revisions, and a stellar library helped catapult it to success, and it sold over 75 million units. And then there's the Wii U. Released in November of 2012, this system never found its footing. It had some excellent games, but a confusing, underused gimmick, terrible marketing, and a really confusing target audience.
Oh yeah, the Wii U is for mature gamers. We have Batman Arkham, Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, and this commercial showing families using the system. Is that badass enough for you?
It all added up to only 13 million systems being sold, making it Nintendo's worst selling home console. And yet, despite these systems performing very differently, they technically died at the same time. When the Nintendo Switch launched, these systems both entered the post-new system phase of life, but it looked very different for both of these systems. The Wii U's last game published by Nintendo was Breath of the Wild, released on the same day the Switch launched. The Wii U version still received all the DLC, but Nintendo's last published game releasing date and date with the succeeding system, it's a little odd, but understandable considering the Wii U. But the 3DS, oh my gosh. Nintendo support for the system did not stop once the Switch launched. Throughout 2017 and 2018, multiple remasters and original titles were published by Nintendo released for the 3DS. The last Nintendo published game for the 3DS was Kirby's Extra Epic Yarn, released on March 7, 2019, over 2 years after the Switch launched.
That'd be as crazy as a PS3 game releasing in 2017. We'll get to that.
It's really hard to find the 3DS's last physical game, but it seems to be a limited run game, and the Wii U's last game was Shakedown Hawaii, released in summer of 2020. Oh my god. But on February 15th, 2022, Nintendo announced that the Wii U and 3DS eShops would be closing in late March of 2023, and the internet lost it. Nintendo can't do this! They're killing so many experiences! Why will they do this? Oh, I'll miss the eShop.
Honey, name one time in the last 4 years you went onto those eShops.
I found the internet's outrage to be ridiculous about this. I mean, this was announced nearly 5 years after the Switch launched and 3 years after the 3DS received its last Nintendo published game. Nobody was using the eShop anymore, that's why they were closing it down. And the way they handled it was perfect in my opinion. They announced its closure over a year before the closure actually happened and closed it gradually. Eventually you couldn't add funds directly, but there was plenty of time to add funds and buy or re-download games you'd want. And with there being a year, it gave plenty of time for everything to be archived. Nothing is being lost, it's forever backed up on the internet. And I just find it ridiculous. Like, you didn't care at all for years, but then all of a sudden, no, you can't close the eShop, we'll lose Pokemon Picross. Not to mention, a couple of weeks later, everyone went back to not caring until March of 2023. It was a bit sad seeing the 3DS and Wii U eShops go, but come on. Both of these systems were more than 10 years old. There was more than enough time to discover, buy, and download any game you'd want prior to its closure. And again, if you couldn't get something, it's out there on the internet and not hard to find. But the Nintendo 3DS and Wii U both died on March 27th, 2023. Although it can still be argued that they're alive because supposedly there's another limited run 3DS game coming and some Wii U online servers are back online too. So I guess the last 3 minutes of what I said were invalidated.
Well, thank God I'm spending my time wisely. Like, I'm about to talk about a PS2 game that came out in 2013.
The PlayStation 2 released on March 4th, 2000 and would go on to be the highest selling game console of all time, selling about 155 million units. I actually kind of hate this. If you look on the best selling consoles Wikipedia page, it says the PS2 sold less than 155 million units, whereas the DS sold 154.02 million units. I don't know about anyone else, but the PS2's number being the way it is, it makes me think Sony was like,
oh, so the DS sold 154 million units? Well, we almost sold 155 million units. Checkmate, f***o.
If the Switch reaches 155 million units, I feel like Sony will go,
oh, well, we did a recount and it turns out we sold 156 million PS2s. Checkmate, f***o.
Anyways, obviously with it selling so well, it would live quite a while. It was succeeded by the PS3 in 2006, but still lived on with a ton of support due to Nintendo's Wii. The Wii was incredibly underpowered, with specs comparable to the PS2. But it had a huge install base as well, so you have two systems with huge install bases that have similar specs. Solve for X. Because of that, many Wii ports of third-party games came to the system, along with ports of PSP games, and of course the sports games, which always received last-gen versions for years to come. The last PS2 game released was Pro Evolution Soccer 2014. However, the PS2 game I find the most fascinating is FIFA 14, which was released on the PlayStation 2 and 3, but was also a launch title for the PlayStation 4. Yes, this game released across 3 generations of PlayStation systems. However, shockingly enough, the PS3 outlived it, even though it only sold a little over half as many units as the PS2. The PlayStation 3 was released in 2006, and its final physical game was the same as the Wii U's in August of 2020. Meaning, even in terms of last physical game, the PS3 outlived the PS2, but its online storefront also still has yet to shut down. In 2021, Sony announced that they would shut down it and the PSP and Vita shops, but kept the PS3 and Vita shops open due to fan backlash. In 2021, and once again, fans protested. I'm sure 75% of the people who complained didn't even own a PS Vita. So yeah, the PS3 is still alive and well, and so is the Xbox 360. Its last physical game was Just Dance 2019, and while it's still up, the Xbox 360's marketplace will close in July of 2024.
No, you can't close the Xbox 360 marketplace. I haven't used it since 2014.
It's crazy that these systems have both been around for almost 20 years and they're still being supported. They both sold quite well, selling well over 80 million units each, yet these two systems outlived the third console of that generation that did even better. The Wii released in 2006 alongside the PS3 and it took off, striking a chord with casual consumers that led to it selling over 100 million units. And like the PS3, its final game was Shakedown Hawaii in 2020. But its online storefront closed before that. The Wii Shop channel closed in January of 2019, but it shutting down before the Wii received its last game makes sense. The Wii Shop channel only sold WiiWare, Wii channels, and virtual console games. Full retail Wii games weren't sold on this storefront. It was all smaller titles as opposed to the 360 and PS3 storefronts, which did sell full retail games. It still is weird though that the Wii, as popular as it was, lived for only 14 years while the PS3 wasn't nearly as popular, but it's still alive and well. So with that, we can expect the PlayStation 4 to die in 2034, while the Switch will die in 2025. But what about the second highest selling console of all time, the DS? Released in 2004, its last game was Big Hero 6 Battle at the Bay in October of 2014, about 10 years after the system launched, which is wacky. The DS was also incredibly popular, so its last game being released in 2014, I mean, it kinda makes sense, but considering that less popular platforms have outlived it, it's a little strange, but ultimately does make sense as handhelds typically don't live as long as home consoles, and that's because handheld technology has consistently grown quicker than home console technology. The jump from every Nintendo handheld, starting with the Game & Watch, has been so much more significant and noticeable than the jump from console to console. And now we're at the point where Nintendo's current home console's gimmick is the fact that it's also a handheld. The Game Boy was released in 1989 and its last title was Pokemon Yellow, released in 1999. However, Nintendo groups the Game Boy with the Game Boy Color, which was released in 1998, and its last title was a Japan exclusive release in 2003.
So the Game Boy technically died in 2003, but it doesn't matter because the PS2 sold 157 million units. Checkmate, f***o!
And the Game Boy Advance was released in 2001, and its last game was Samurai Deeper Kyo in 2008, lasting about 7 years.
And that's something pretty common with older systems. Much like human lifespans, as time has gone on, console lifespans have become longer and longer. Now, consoles back then still lived a pretty decent amount of time, but not as long as consoles these days live.
The Nintendo Entertainment System was first released in 1983 in Japan as the Famicom, and the last title was Adventure Island 4 in 1994. The Super Nintendo also launched first in Japan, and its last physical title was Fire Emblem Trachea 776 in January of 2000. However, it has had a few games since. Metal Slayer Glory Director's Cut was playable on the Nintendo Power downloadable cartridge later in 2000, and Star Fox 2, an originally unreleased game, was included with the Super Nintendo Classic Edition in 2017. But support for the system ended in 2000, 10 years after its initial release. Speaking of Nintendo systems, the Nintendo 64 was launched in 1996, and its last game was Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 in 2002, not even a year after the GameCube launched, but it makes sense as the Nintendo 64 only sold about 33 million units, and its successor, the GameCube, released in 2001, received its last game, Madden NFL 08, in 2007, which again makes sense because it was a lower seller. As for non-Nintendo systems, the Sega Master System was released in 1985, and its last title was Mickey's Ultimate Challenge in 1998. The Sega Master System sold a mere 10 million units over here, and yet it survived 13 years, longer than any of Nintendo's first few systems, the DS, hell, even the 3DS? Speaking of shockingly lasting 13 years, the Atari 2600 launched in 1977, and its last game was Klax in 1990. But it does make a bit more sense for it to live this long because it did sell 30 million units and also popularized home console gaming. It also nearly killed the industry.
But those are all systems that had lengthy or perfectly normal lifespans. However, unfortunately, not every console is able to live that long. And usually if they don't, they kind of deserve it.
The Panasonic 3DO was released in 1993, good for it. It is a game console at launch, which means it's up there with the PlayStation 2. Congratulations, Panasonic. However, its price was unbelievable. $700 in 1993. I mean, these days, $700 is still extremely pricey for a game console. But when you adjust for inflation, oh my fucking God. No wonder why this system absolutely flopped. Its last game was Creature Shock, released in 1996. It always sucks to hear about a system that flopped, but when it costed the equivalent of $1,400, you're just asking for it at that point. The Nokia N-Gage was released in 2003, and it was revolutionary in a very specific way. It was a handheld console that doubled as a phone. This was years before Apple introduced the iPhone, so this was something new, but it sure as hell didn't shock anyone. Only 3 million units were sold, which isn't terrible, but there was no place in the market for it. When it released, the Game Boy Advance was alive and kicking, and in the next few years, the DS and PSP also hit the shelves, and the N-Gage simply couldn't compete with those three juggernauts. It was a cool concept, but there was just no room in the market for it. As I mentioned earlier, the Atari 2600 honestly did pretty well, and its successor sure didn't. The Atari 5200 released in 1982, right before the video game market crashed in 1983. There are a ton of reasons why the market crashed, but with a console trying to get its feet off the ground in the middle of the crash, it was impossible for Atari. The 5200 is okay, but it just wasn't a large enough step forward from the 2600 for most to warrant upgrading. Its last game was Gremlins in 1984, and in total, only around 1 million units were sold.
Only f***ing idiots own an Atari 5200. God damn it.
Atari had a couple of more consoles after the 5200, the 7800, the Lynx, and the Jaguar. And while these all didn't perform that great, they all lived at least 5 years, which I consider to be the lower end of a healthy console lifespan. Not a notable length, but not laughably short either.
And what the f happened with the Lynx? How did that live 14 years, as long as the damn Wii?
But that didn't stop Atari from releasing another failed console. While the original Atari is long gone, the current Atari company attempted to re-enter the console space in 2021 with the Atari VCS. I started seeing stuff about this system in 2020, and it confused the hell out of me. This was around the time I truly got into gaming, and so to see Atari was gearing up to launch a new console around the same time Sony and Microsoft were getting ready to launch their new systems, I knew something wasn't gonna go well. And surprise, surprise, the VCS failed. I like some of its ideas, mainly just the idea of Atari releasing ways to play their older titles in the modern day, but there were still countless Atari collections already. The VCS was to be a microconsole. What does that mean? Who gives a shit? It has no games worth a damn. It was released in 2021 and did okay at first, but saw a 90% commercial sales decrease from 2021 to 2022. I mean, it was $400 for the bundle that came with the system and the controllers, the same price as the PS5 digital edition. The base system was $300. The same price as an Xbox Series S. Atari still sells it now at a cheaper price, but they stopped producing new ones. I just assumed they're selling out old stock. It still is supported and technically alive, but I never saw or heard anything about this thing except for the fact it failed.
Only f***ing idiots own an Atari VCS. Thank God!
Thankfully, since then, Atari has gotten the right idea. They're gearing up to release the Atari 2600 Plus, a modern-day 2600 that accepts most old 2600 and even some 7800 cartridges. It'll be $130, and there are various other games and accessories releasing for it, all for fair prices. This is technically an Atari 2600, and Atari is technically releasing 2600 games, so can the 2600 still be considered to be alive?
No, because it's gonna flop.
It seems to be a novelty item. It's not meant to compete in the same market as the Switch, Series X, and PS5, but rather its own little market, one that I wish Nintendo would dabble in more than just releasing digital-only microconsoles. And speaking of Nintendo, the Virtual Boy, Nintendo's 32-bit VR abomination. Released in 1995 as a pseudo-successor to the Game Boy, the Virtual Boy flopped, failing to even sell 1 million units. It was the brainchild of the late Gunpei Yokoi, a very important figure to Nintendo's history and handheld gaming in general. He came up with the Game & Watch and Game Boy. This man revolutionized handheld gaming. And f***ed it over. I don't at all blame Yokoi for the failure of the Virtual Boy. It was a really cool concept, but there were so many other aspects to it that led to its failure. It was rushed, too ambitious, and overall just poorly executed. Its last title was 3D Tetris, released in March of 1996, not even a year after the system launched. It's a shame it flopped, but like the 3DO, come on.
But the Virtual Boy doesn't compare to the Gizmondo, an N-Gage-like console released by Tiger Telematics. The system flopped. It launched in North America on October 22nd, 2005 with 14 games, and 14 games share the title of the last Gizmondo game. Not only did it flop, but the company went bankrupt not much longer, and many of the company's figureheads were arrested due to ties to a Swedish mafia. There'll be a biopic about this company and console sometime, I guarantee it. The death of a console always hurts. Hearing that a console you grew up with has gotten its last game and its online storefronts is shut down, it always hurts. But like death itself, it's a natural part of life. Old consoles must die for new consoles to strive. And ultimately, the death of a console is a good thing, because that means the company can now put all their efforts towards their new system or whatever other future endeavors they have. Every console dies under certain conditions, and I always think it's cool to see how certain consoles die. They usually don't go out with a bang, but sometimes it ends with people being arrested because they're tied to a Swedish mafia. I'm never gonna get over the Gizmondo. It can hurt, but there's usually good reasoning behind it, even if the internet can be totally oblivious to it. But a console dying doesn't mean it's gone forever. The Wii died in 2020 and I can still play games on it. The DS died in 2014 and I can still use PictoChat. No console is ever really gone. Except for my damn 3DS. I read the instruction manual and called Nintendo customer service, and they said they weren't repairing 3DSs anymore. What do you mean? And if Nintendo isn't willing to help me, that makes me question, how am I gonna play LEGO Marvel Super Heroes now?